Hi and welcome to School Shorts. I'm Melissa Chan Green, journalist and mum of two with an interest in learning. Today we are looking at the myths that surround maths, those misconceptions that are commonly held, and yet there are some facts about maths that aren't so widely known about, like a specific learning difficulty. We're joined by an expert in how the brain learns maths, Daniel Ansari from Western University in Canada. Daniel, I have to admit that my passion is in literacy, and this was going to be purely about literacy until I realised the link actually between early math skills and literacy and reading skills. And there's been a particular study around that, hasn't there?
Yeah, there have been lots of studies around it. So in 2008, Greg Duncan published a study in developmental psychology where they put together various data sets from around the world. So this was a large international collaborative study. And one of the things that they found there was that early math was a very strong predictor of not only later math, but also later reading skills. But there is a very important caveat here that since that study was published, thinking around the data analysis has changed. And the sort of new reanalysis, without going into all of the statistical data, suggests that that finding may not be as strong. Having said that, we do know that there are strong correlations between the development of reading and the development of math skills. We don't yet fully understand yet what directionality that is. So does reading contribute to math? Does math contribute to reading? Probably what's the case is that they're just interwoven with one another in multiple ways that are quite complex to sort of disentangle.
Are there any myths around maths? Because one that springs to mind is that people generally think that boys are better than girls. Is that true?
Most of the data. So let me answer it in several ways. First of all, that is a very persistent view, one that is shared in the public sphere quite often. I would say that most of the research suggests that there's more evidence for gender similarities than there is for gender differences. So, for example, we did a study some years ago now with around 1,500 children in the Netherlands from grades 1 to 6 on very basic number processing tasks, like the ones I've described to you: number line estimation, number comparison, dot comparison, etc., etc. We found almost no gender differences and lots of evidence for similarities. When you look at international comparison studies, such as the Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA, you will see that, yes, in some countries, boys outperform girls, but the reverse is also true in other countries. So I think often we need to look for cultural factors that might play into this, where if the cultural norms are such that there is a implicit assumption that if a girl is born, they're not necessarily going to be good at math, then society and the education system can also reinforce an idea, and sort of don't. If society doesn't encourage young women to go into STEM careers, then they might not. So
it could be like a
my
self-fulfilling
reading of the
prophecy.
data is there's more evidence for similarities.
Right. I found this study really interesting, that impact on, and I guess this would have cultural factors too, but the impact on a teacher's anxiety on the stereotypes and the thinking that played out around ability between the genders by the end of the year. Do you mind just kind of outlining that study?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's work started by Sion Beilock, who was then at the University of Chicago, but has been replicated since. What they were able to show was that teachers' mathematics anxiety was correlated with the students' math anxiety and their math performance at the end of grade 1. So they measured students. I should backtrack a little bit. So they measured both teacher and student math anxiety at the beginning of grade 1. And then they measured student and teacher math anxiety at the end of grade 1, as well as student math ability. And what they found that at the beginning of grade one, there was no relationship between the math anxiety of the teacher and the math anxiety of the students. By the end of grade one, there was. And the math anxiety of the teacher at the beginning of grade one predicted the student's math ability at the end of grade one. So this then suggests that the teacher's math anxiety sort of rubs off onto the students. There was a further nuance to that, in that they also measured children's implicit gender stereotypes. So they asked the children, they gave the students gender neutral stories. Let's say, Johnny, not gender neutral. They would say, there is a student who's really good at math. Can you draw a picture of them? And the students were more likely to draw a boy when the story was about somebody who was good at math, and more likely to draw a girl when the story was about somebody who was good at reading. And these implicit stereotypes mediated that relationship between teacher math anxiety at the beginning of grade one and student math ability at the end of grade one. So yes, teachers' math anxiety does seem to affect students. And you can imagine how that works. If a teacher doesn't like math and they teach it, they might implicitly, even though they, with their best intentions, are not to let this sort of shine through, it does come through. And students are very sensitive to what their teacher's feeling and how they're reacting. And that might then suggest to them as well that, math is something to be afraid of.
Yeah, I guess as parents, that's a good reminder too, to kind of watch our language around maths or any other subject, really. And not saying, oh, I was never very good at maths, or, oh, I didn't enjoy maths, or, rolling your eyes when it's maths homework, because clearly there is evidence that anxiety can rub off in some way, particularly in the classroom.
Absolutely. And there's evidence that this is true for parents. So
Yeah.
again, from Sian Bailong's group, there was another study which showed that parents' math anxiety affects students' math anxiety. So yes, we have to be careful about it.
Maths anxiety is, some people might just think, oh, yeah, you didn't like maths, but maths anxiety is a real thing, isn't it? It's more than, I guess, just a dislike for maths.
Yes, it can be absolutely debilitating for students if people have done focus groups, sort of qualitative data analysis, talking to students about their feeling towards math, and it can be quite visceral. And there's also a social component to it, that if you feel like you're not good at math, it makes you afraid that will be visible to others, and that you might be, discriminated against because you're not good at math. So no, math anxiety is definitely a real thing. It's predicted by a multitude of factors that have to do with the classroom, the teacher, the parent, the educational system that you're in. It's a very complex phenomenon, but it's serious, because math anxiety, we think, leads to math avoidance. And math avoidance leads to decreasing number of people who engage with math-related careers in the long run. And also, away from the economics of it, the enjoyment of math, the beauty of math, the discovery process, the world it opens for young minds, can be lost if they're avoiding this subject because they've had a negative experience, or they felt they weren't as good as somebody else.
Is there any data around how many people might be affected by maths anxiety? I guess if we're only kind of learning more about it recently, then it's probably hard to know that information.
Yeah, and that also always depends on how you define math anxiety, right? Because math anxiety is measured typically by a survey or a questionnaire, where you give students a number of questions and ask them, how does that make you feel? For example, doing your math homework, or sitting in a math classroom, or giving change at the cashier. And we can set different cutoff points, but it's not like we have an objective measure of math anxiety. But by the criterion that most people use, I would say is probably about 5% of the population would be a conservative estimate who present with math anxiety. But then I also expect that will differ quite a bit across different contexts.
Yeah. What is the difference between maths anxiety and dyscalculia, which I know is actually more of a a learning difficulty. Would that be the right way to describe it with maths?
Yes, exactly. So dyscalculia is a persistent inability, in spite of instruction, to learn very fundamental math concepts and to develop fluency with math facts. It's called dyscalculia, which is, it's kind of a disorder of the process of learning how to calculate. It is different from math anxiety, though, because you can be perfectly fine in terms of your math ability and still develop math anxiety, and conversely, you can be dyscalculic but not experience any math anxiety. It's a beautiful study out of the University of Cambridge showing this in a very large representative sample, that dyscalculics are more likely to have math anxiety, but it's not as though the two are the same. And that's important as well for parents and educators to know, because math anxiety in most students is something that perhaps can be alleviated, freeing their minds and enabling them to learn math. Whereas dyscalculia may be something that, you have trouble with numbers throughout your life, and you need accommodations and you need ways to accommodate and partially overcome those
Yeah. So
difficulties.
you're saying that
It's an
if a
important.
child says, I'm struggling with maths or I'm finding this really difficult, not to assume that they have dyscalculia or they have an actual difficulty with learning maths, but potentially it's a mental block. And once they maybe have a better understanding about how maths can relate to their life or the benefit it might have in their future, they might be able to lift that maths anxiety and enjoy it and learn it without difficulty.
Exactly. Exactly. A student with math anxiety, because math anxiety, the way we think it exerts its effect on performance is that the experience of anxiety takes away cognitive resources that you would otherwise devote to doing the math. So if you can reappraise the way you think about math, then you free up more cognitive resources to learn it. So yes, it
Isn't that just
it,
so
it can be
relevant
altered.
to so many things? If you have anxiety around anything or something that are dreading doing, and you think, wow, actually, I'm using a lot of mental load worrying about that. Or if I just kind of stopped and carried on, then it might not be so hard. What are some math games or some kind of easy things perhaps that parents could think about doing at home with their children that's not kind of sit down and do homework, but something I guess that
Mm,
feels kind of fun and is
mm,
a good way to practice?
mm. I mean, for young learners, I think snakes and ladders. I don't know what you call it
Yeah,
in New
snakes and
Zealand. Do you call it
ladders.
snakes and ladders?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's very effective, because it teaches children about numbers, number relations. It teaches them about single digit, multi-digit numbers. It's an excellent game. It's a lot of fun. Um, I played it with my son when he was, 4 and 5 for at least a year, I would say. I don't have any direct evidence where that helped him, but there is empirical evidence to show that these kinds of number games help. Um, Playing card games, anything that involves quantities, numerical symbols is great. There is a wonderful game, and I have no conflict of interest here with this, but it's called Tiny Polka Dots. It's basically a deck of cards that has either symbols or dots or various ways of representing quantity, and it gives a lot of different games that you can play with it, and that can build children's understanding of number, numerical relations, and help them to think abstractly about sets.
Cool. That sounds good one. Tiny polka dots. I will look that up. What should we be thinking of when we are teaching numbers?
I think one really important thing is that children need to learn the association between the abstract symbols, so the Arabic numerals, and the number words. Number words are also symbolic representations, and the concrete quantities in the world around them. In fact, many in the math education world and in the research world around how children learn early number think about a continuum from concrete, so using concrete materials, to using pictorial or representational materials, such as painting, drawing groups of objects on a page, and then abstract. And this is the sort of learning continuum, the progression that we need to help children advance through. And they may be going back and forward. If you think somebody has grasped what numbers mean in a concrete way, you move on to pictorial, but you find out that actually they need to go back to concrete, or some learners need to spend longer in the concrete
So
phase.
what you said that
But
was really
there's
the
so many
word there that
aspects to
was
early number
interesting,
learning.
Daniel, was about groups. Because I guess if you're pointing at a line of things and you say, this is 1, this is 2, this is 3, does a child think, well, the name of that is 1, the name of that is 2, the name of that is 3? Do you have to say, this is 1, and then add the next thing and say, now together that's 2, and add the next thing? Is it thinking more about groups rather than names?
Yes, I think that's right. I think that's right, is explicitly labeling the sets, and that's what's very difficult to understand. So in the beginning, it's really important to start out with materials that all look the same. You don't want to start out with materials that are very heterogeneous in their appearance, because only gradually do children understand that number is an abstract property of sets. What you've said, and in there, it's also important for them to be able to decompose and recompose those sets, to, for example, recognize that 3 can be decomposed into a set of 2 and a set of 1, and they can be recomposed into 3. Then they start to understand the relationship between sets.
How early
Not
should you be talking about numbers and about kind of mathematical ideas? How early can you introduce that?
Well, I think you can start quite early at 1.5, 2 years of age, just talking, bringing numbers into the conversation, labeling sets, counting out together, reading books at bedtime that contain numerical information, drawing children's attention to this very abstract property of objects in the world around them. You can start early, I think, and that will help children then when they get more into the formal phases of learning, because you've already helped them lay some of the foundations.
And then how early might you be able to see, or is it reasonable to see whether a child may be having difficulty with understanding maths concepts?
That's a very difficult question. I don't think we fully have the answer. I think, of course, everybody always advocates for early detection of learning difficulties, early screening, but we do have to recognize that young children are very variable, and that they may look like they're having a difficulty, but 2, 3 weeks later, they're just fine and they're grasping it. So Dorothy Bishop at the University of Oxford has done a lot of work on developmental language disorders. And one of the things that she has shown is that there's a high degree of false positives when it comes to sort of attempts to diagnose language difficulties early on.
Right.
So it is tricky. I think the way I like to think about it is not necessarily about detecting difficulties, but detecting children who might be at risk of developing such difficulties because they lack foundational skills. It's more of a sort of a strength-based way of thinking about it, that in technically most children will be able to gain these foundational competencies, but some of them have had more opportunities perhaps in the home through informal education than others. So we should use evidence-based methods to detect what competencies they already have and which ones still require some work and require input from an educator or from a parent. So I don't think we can diagnose a persistent learning difficulty in the very early years, but we might be able to prevent one from developing through identifying strengths and weaknesses and then working on those weaknesses.
And so if we go back to numbers then and counting, is there something that you can do, a test? I'm not sure if that's really the right word, but is there something you can do with your child, perhaps a question or a conversation to check that they actually have some understanding of the name to, amount correlation?
Yeah, there's some informal ways in which you can sort of distinguish between whether a child just has an understanding of the count sequence, can recite it fluently, or whether they actually understand what it's for. And one task that we in our field of numerical and mathematical cognition use a lot was developed by Karen Wynn back in the 90s. It's called the give a number task. And the idea is simply, I have a pile full of objects which I put in front of the child. And then I ask them to give me 1, 2, 4, 3, 6. And so I can test whether they can actually, when they hear 6, whether they can actively convert that into the set of items. And young children who don't understand yet the link between number words and quantities, they will just give you lots of them. And so that's when you can, that's one way you can detect what numbers do they actually already know. But I would say here to parents listening to this, don't get alarmed if your child doesn't yet understand that, but use that as an opportunity to work on it. But I would not get alarmed, for example, if a 3.5-year-old isn't yet able to give you 4 objects.
Yeah. What other screeners, I know this is a field that you have been working in, what other screeners are around perhaps, I guess, more for when they're older, or what would you recommend?
Yeah, so there are some good psychoeducational tools, not as many as there are in literacy, and we are actively working on this actually. But we developed some years ago a screener called the numeracy screener, which is a paper and pencil test. You can find it at numeracyscreener.org. And we're now developing a digital version of that, which will be a big improvement on the paper and pencil version. So there are also commercial. Our tools is for free, but there's also commercial ones around. Nancy Jordan out of the University of Delaware has a very nice number sense screener for the early years. There is also David Popura has an early years numeracy assessment tool. I unfortunately forget the name right now, but there are definitely screeners around.
And
they are not really meant for parents to administer.
What's the purpose of your screener? Why would a parent or a teacher use it?
Our screener is the one that's currently publicly available. The digital one is forthcoming, but the publicly available one is a very simple number discrimination task. So you see, for example, the numbers 1 and 6, and you have to cross out the larger of the two numbers. That kind of measure, we know, predicts later math scores. We found in our research that individual differences, so how children differ in their performance on this, predicts their later math abilities. Why might that be the case? Well, it examines your knowledge of the numbers and also your ability to retrieve the meaning of those numerical symbols. And so it's a rich, kind of quick assessment of your basic understanding of numerical quantity and how numerical quantities are represented by symbols. So that's why we designed the numeracy screener on the basis of lots of research showing that skills such as number comparison are related to later math ability. But now we have a whole suite of different kinds of assessment tools. So we've already built one that includes both single and double digits. We're about to build one that tests children's understanding of numerical order, that numbers are part of an ordered sequence. We're also going more into spatial kind of tasks with number lines, because we know there's a tight association between space and number. So our work, and also the work of others who are designing screener, is really guided by the evidence around what do we know is predictive of later math skills. We're very heavily influenced by the reading or literacy work, where you can really screen for phonics. So we're kind of trying to design the phonics for math kind of assessments, although I don't think there's a one-to-one equivalence there, but that's kind of the motivation behind these.
So you're saying that up until now, or up until recently when this work has been done around screeners, we haven't really been able to establish where a child is in their understanding, or if they have that base knowledge understanding? Is this, I guess, giving us more information about where a child might be achieving in relation to others?
Yeah, and also, just for an individual child, you can use this, for example, to monitor, track the performance over a year. So you could start in the beginning of kindergarten, test in the middle and in the end, and see which children are actually showing a trajectory of growth and which children are not. I think we've had an understanding of how to assess early math, but there haven't been as many tools that early childhood educators can use. These tools are not really designed for parents because, they're not really designed for parents to administer as such. I'm sure people have downloaded our numeracy screener and keen parents, but they're more, we intend their use to be more as supporting educators in their practice, as performance monitoring tools, as tools to identify gaps.
And when you say kindergarten,
and also as ways of reinforcing their intuition.
When you say kindergarten, sorry to interrupt there. I think kindergarten is referred to in different countries as different ages. Are you meaning kind of from 5?
Yeah, 4, 5.
Right.
That I would say the years from 4 through to 6, basically that transition into formal education.
Yeah, right. Okay. Thank you so much, Daniel, for your time today. That's given us lots of food for thought, I think, and anyone who has maybe a dislike of maths might be rethinking that around their children, or certainly rethinking the way that they talk about that. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks so much for tuning in today. If that topic was helpful for you and you'd like to hear more, please do like and subscribe. It sends me that feedback. School Shorts is all about supporting busy parents who want their children to thrive. Follow on social at SchoolShortsNZ for fun ideas, helpful resources, and exclusive giveaways.